Hi everyone, it's Ardith, and today I've got some masking techniques to share with you, using some of the products from the latest Essentials by Ellen release, which is available now. I'm going to start with some easy techniques that are perfect for beginners to masking, using simple tools. To start, I stamped the newest leading lady, Cooking Lady, off the bottom left edge of a piece of Neenah Solar White 80-pound cardstock, with Gina K Amalgam ink in jet black. This ink is Copic friendly and ink blending friendly, so it's perfect for this. This lady has her hand outstretched, perfect for holding things. And here's what I put in her hand, a club sandwich. This goes perfectly with the sentiment I used, but I wanted to really put the focus on the sandwich by stacking it up high. I masked her arm by cutting a slight curve into some Post-it tape before positioning the club sandwich in her hand. I realized that I needed to trim down the rough mask along her arm because of the size of the sandwich, but that's the first tip. A mask doesn't have to be exact or perfect. I only wanted the olive on the very top of the sandwich, and the bottom is nice and smooth, and those two things make it easier to start my stamping at the top. So I kind of counted up how high I wanted to go with some rough spacing estimates. When I had it placed, I closed my MISTI door and inked it up with the same amalgam ink before stamping it. Then I placed a small piece of Post-it tape over the sandwich before cleaning the stamp and repositioning it so that the olive would stamp onto the Post-it tape, but the rest of the sandwich would stamp on the cardstock. You want the stamp as clean as possible to reduce the possibility of smudges. And because the overlap area is so small, I just moved the mask down to the new bottom of the sandwich and I repeated the process. The only thing I had to do was make sure that the sides of the sandwich were lined up, and now it's looking like this is how the stamp was made. Having a MISTI makes this easier, but you could definitely do this with an acrylic block if you wanted. After I stamped the third sandwich, you can see that I didn't have enough room for a full sandwich again before I got to her hand. So this time I positioned the stamp so that the base of the sandwich would be in her hand and the top couple of layers were stamped onto the Post-it tape. And when I removed the mask, it looked like this was how the sandwich was meant to be. Here's another little tip. If I missed any lines or things weren't connected properly because of the masks, I could use a black Copic liner pen to fill them in and no one would ever know. I'd previously cut apart the Welcome to the Club sentiment, but here I just fit the two pieces back together before stamping them with my MISTI. Off camera, I trimmed the panel to fit onto a square card, and I colored the sandwich with my Copic markers. Then I wanted to do a bit of ink blending to really keep the focus on the sandwich. To do that, I used more Post-it tape to create a negative mask this time. I found it easier to line up horizontally rather than vertically, but you can do what works best for you. I eyeballed the distance between the sandwich and the edge of the Post-it tape, but I tried to keep it even and straight. And then I eyeballed the size of the sandwich, and rather than cutting an exact mask, I just used a piece of Post-it tape to cover it. And finally, I stamped just the lady's arm onto a piece of Post-it tape, and I used sharp scissors to cut it out. Another tip for masking, use sharp scissors to cut your mask out, especially if the image is very complex. This one's pretty smooth and simple. And one more tip, to get a really good close mask, whether you're stamping or ink blending over the mask, cut right on the stamped line of the image so that the ink can get right up close. I'll have more tips for this technique on the next card, which is a bit more complex. I used more Post-it tape to cover the rest of the panel on the left side. There is nothing worse than doing all this work and then blending ink where you didn't want it, and that's a lesson I learned the hard way. I used a couple of Catherine Pooler inks in the yellow family, Limoncello and Tiki Torch, and I blended them with a life-changing blender brush into the open space around my sandwich. I was trying to create a warm glow around it. I used Limoncello, the lighter yellow, all over, and then Tiki Torch just on the edges of the strip. And even though I've been stamping for over 12 years now, I never get tired of seeing the reveal when I remove the mask. You can see that the edges of the sandwich are not perfectly inked because I used the Post-it tape rather than painstakingly cutting it all out. But I think it looks great, and knowing how much work I saved makes it look even better. To finish it off, I colored the portion of the lady's arm that is in the colored strip with a couple of blue markers for her shirt and some skin tones for her hand. I chose blue as a contrast to the yellow glow. To finish this card, I glued the panel to a craft card base and added some diamond stickles along the edges of the yellow strip. My next card uses another new Essentials by Ellen, Good Egg, and masking to create a scene. I started by putting each chicken from the set onto a separate acrylic block. You can use a MISTI or just one block if you want, but I found that this gave me flexibility and convenience since I hadn't really planned out what I was going to do. In fact, this is me creating my plan. And that's another tip. If you're doing a complicated scene or multiple masking, you may want to make a plan. I started by stamping what I thought would be my first chicken. I even labeled him number 1 with a blue pen. And then I continued building my scene by stamping the other chickens around the first one, paying attention to which way they were facing. And you'll see that I ended up putting the chick where he would be in front of my number 1 chicken, so that numbering went by the wayside. If I found there was too much overlap in my stamping, I would only ink up the part of the chicken that I thought would show. I kept working and filling it in until I felt like I had good balance and interest. And then I got out my blue pen again. I thought about which chickens were in front of the others, because the ones that are in the front are the ones you stamp first. I find it helpful to have my plan next to me when I'm stamping for real, and having the images numbered helps me make sure that everyone is where they need to be when I'm done. So now some more tips for cutting masks. First, material. I like to use full-back sticky notes. They stay in place while you're stamping or blending ink over top. You can also use temporary adhesive if you don't have these. Also, if you're cutting one mask, you may as well cut 2, or 3, or 4. These notes are stuck together, so it's very easy to cut multiples. As I said before, use sharp scissors, but another thing I find helpful is to cut down the shape to something closer to the image right off the bat. Then you're not dealing with large pieces hitting your hand or getting stuck in your scissors. You can stamp on the edges of sticky notes so that you don't waste as much as I did here. My others all had 2 on one note, but this one was the final one I stamped. Try holding your scissors still in one hand and moving the paper with your other. This will help you get smoother curves. And another note, I cut off their legs. Because the legs are just lines rather than outlines, they won't cover each other in the scene, even if I do have an area where more than one chicken is standing. As I said before, try to cut right on the stamped line so that the stamping and blending can get right up to the image. And here's one final tip. This rooster's tail was so narrow, I ended up cutting it right off, but I kept the pieces. There's no rule that says your mask has to be only in one piece. Once I had all the masks cut, I finally started stamping. Actually, first I drew a straight line to act as my ground, and then I stamped. I put my plan next to me and I stamped the chick before masking him with his mask. Then I stamped my number 2 bird and masked him. Notice that I'm using the second or underneath mask. I plan to save the stamped masks for another time, which is coming sooner than I thought, by the way, and I find it easier to use them when I can exactly see what they are. When I got to some of the chickens in the back, where just their heads and backs were going to show, I used some Post-it tape as extra masking, just to be sure I didn't get any nests or odd parts in the wrong places. And when I stamped the rooster, you can see that the 4-piece mask worked just as well as if it were 1 piece. And then it was done. And I got all excited to see how it looked, and I took off all the masks. Dumb, since I wanted to do some ink blending on the background, and I should have done that before I removed the masks. But here you can see how I plan to store the masks right on the stamp set, so that they're all ready to go for the next time. And the next time is now. I'll spare you the redo, but this time I added a strip of Post-it tape along the bottom where I had drawn the pencil line. I erased that first because once it's trapped under the ink, it won't erase cleanly. I created a large negative mask using a circle die and some scrap paper. There is sticky masking paper this big, but I don't have any, so I just used this with some repositionable adhesive. Once I had it in place, I covered up that other little bit of the circle at the bottom so I wouldn't have any blending mistakes. And then I blended the same 2 yellow inks all over, filling in the background to add a bit of interest to the card without adding any layers. I removed all the masks except the nest, which extended below the ground line, and I very lightly blended some sandcastle ink just so that the chickens weren't standing in the air. I colored all the chickens in off camera with my Copics, and then I used part of the Welcome to the Club sentiment along with the nest word from Backyard Bird Friends, which was released earlier this year. I trimmed the panel down for a square card, and then I used my Misty and the same black ink to stamp the sentiment. To finish this card, I glued the panel to a craft card base and added diamond stickles along the edge of the yellow ink blending. I think these guys are adorable. I hope you found these masking tips useful and will give them a try. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a thumbs up below and subscribe to my channel for more inspiration. Product links are below in the description and also on my blog. Thanks so much for watching. See you next time.